When the USDA truck pulled into my driveway, I felt my stomach drop. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I knew exactly who was behind the complaint that brought him here. Karen Matthews, my neighbor, or as I like to call her, the Queen of Petty. She'd been on my case ever since I started selling organic eggs at the farmer's market, said my roosters woke her up, my compost smelled like death, and my free-range chickens ran wild. I ignored her for months, but then, she found the one weapon she thought could finally shut me down: the USDA. The inspector stepped out of the white truck with that clipboard and sunglasses confidence that instantly rubbed me the wrong way. His name tag read Inspector D. Riley. The man didn't smile, didn't even say hello, just scanned the property like he was sizing up a crime scene. "You're Mr. Hayes?" he asked, his voice sharp as a shovel edge. "Yes, sir. That's me," I replied, wiping my hands on my jeans. "What's this about?" "Anonymous complaint," he said flatly. "Allegations of unsanitary livestock conditions and potential contamination of local runoff." I clenched my jaw. Anonymous complaint. Sure. I could practically hear Karen's nasally voice echoing in those words. I tried to stay calm. "You're welcome to take a look around. Everything's up to code. I run a clean operation." He gave a thin smirk. "We'll see." The man moved through my property like he was searching for something to hate. He pointed at my chicken coop. "Coop doors aren't sealed properly," he said. "They're ventilated," I corrected. USDA Code Section 205.239, adequate ventilation for organic livestock. He scribbled something on his clipboard without responding. Next, he stopped by the feed shed. He poked a grain bag with his pen and frowned like he'd caught me red-handed. "This grain looks damp." "It rained yesterday," I said. "Roof leaks a bit, fixing it this week." He wrote again. Another mark. Everywhere he went, it felt like he was twisting harmless details into violations. The kind of guy who didn't care about truth, just wanted a reason to feel important. Finally, he walked toward the barn where my goats were kept. "You got a hand-washing station nearby?" "Sure do," I said, pointing to a portable sink by the gate. He leaned over it, ran his finger along the basin, and held it up like he'd found a crime scene fingerprint. "Dust," he muttered. I wanted to laugh, but the humor was long gone by then. After 2 hours of that, I could feel my patience thinning like wire about to snap. I followed him as he finished his notes. "So, what's the verdict?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He closed his folder with a smug click. "We'll be filing a report. I'll need to review the data before making a final determination." That meant trouble. When a USDA inspector said, "filing a report," it wasn't casual. It meant my farm might be flagged, my certification suspended, or worse, my license revoked. All because my neighbor wanted quiet mornings. As he started walking back to his truck, Karen appeared right on cue, standing at the end of her driveway with her arms crossed, a coffee mug in hand, and that snake-like grin. "Oh, Inspector Riley," she called sweetly. "I do hope you're taking care of that mess next door." He didn't respond, but I saw the faintest smirk tug at his mouth. They knew each other. I could feel it in my gut. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through every USDA compliance booklet I owned. I wasn't rich, but I ran my small organic farm by the book, every guideline, every inspection, every form. The thought of losing it all over Karen's lies made my blood boil. Then I noticed something. Riley's name, I'd seen it before. I grabbed a folder from my filing cabinet and pulled out an inspection record from 2 years back, the one from when I'd applied for my organic certification. Same guy, same inspector, and he'd failed me then, too, for a reason that later turned out to be false. Back then, he'd claimed my soil didn't meet organic standards, but a state retest proved otherwise. Still, I'd lost 3 months of sales waiting for reinstatement. Now he was back on another anonymous complaint targeting me again. My fists clenched around the file. This wasn't random. Something stank here, and it wasn't my compost. The next morning, I decided to follow procedure. I called the USDA regional office. They confirmed Riley was a field inspector covering our county, and yes, anonymous complaints could trigger spot checks. "Can I see the complaint?" I asked. Not unless it becomes part of an appeal, the woman said kindly. But if you believe there's misconduct, you can file a counter-report. Misconduct. The word stuck in my head. That night, I walked the property again, flashlight in hand, thinking about every possible angle. My animals were clean, my fences sturdy, my feet sealed. Everything was in order. So what could Riley possibly find to justify another report? And then it hit me. Riley didn't need to find something. He just needed to say he did. He could write anything in his inspection notes, and unless I had proof otherwise, it would be my word against his. And given his record, he'd win. But if I could prove he was wrong, if I could catch him missing something that every inspector should notice, maybe I could turn the tables. So I set out to find the one thing on my farm Riley hadn't inspected. The thing he'd completely overlooked. And by the time I found it, I knew exactly how to make him regret ever stepping foot on my land. The next morning, the paper slid under my front door like a taunt. A notice from the USDA, a preliminary finding. Potential non-compliance, it said, in bureaucratic black and white. They wanted samples, records, and immediate access to all areas. I stared at those words until they blurred. My phone started ringing before I finished reading. "Is it true?" asked Marla from the Saturday market. Her voice sounded small. "People are asking why your stall wasn't there yesterday." "They said potential," I replied, forcing steady in my voice. "I'm on it. But potential is poison in a small farming town. People jump at the whisper of risk, especially when it comes to food. A few of my regulars canceled pre-orders. The co-op called to say they'd pause pickups until the investigation cleared up. By noon, Karen was practically doing cartwheels across the fence line. She waved the preliminary finding like a flag. "Serving the community," she crowed to anyone who'd listen. Inspector Riley, meanwhile, stayed invisible. No call, no visit, just that piece of paper that had the power to shut me down. I tried calling him at the regional office. His line went straight to voicemail. That afternoon, a county health inspector showed up, not Riley. Someone else. She wanted to take water samples and asked to see my feed invoices and animal health logs. I handed them over. I showed her the receipts, veterinary notes, the feed storage inspection I'd done last month. Everything. She was thorough and professional. She even smiled at my goats in a way that made them bleat back like they knew they were being judged kindly. At the end of the visit, she said, "You keep good records, Mr. Hayes. This should clear up quick." I wanted to believe her. But belief doesn't pay the feed bill or repair a roof. The notice said my organic certification could be suspended pending investigation. That meant no farmer's market, no co-op checks, no weekend income. I sat in the barn with a flashlight and counted expenses like a man counting wounds. That night, I went to the hardware store. I wasn't thinking about hammers. I was thinking about how to protect the farm and myself. I needed proof that whatever Riley wrote in his report was false. Eye for eye with paperwork. Over the next week, things got worse. The preliminary finding became a formal complaint. My name got whispered at the market. A local food blogger who liked reading dirt more than she liked tomatoes wrote a post titled, "Local Organic Farm Under USDA Review." The comments were quick, judgmental, hungry for scandal. Riley's report, when it arrived in its full, tidy package, read like a dossier written to impress his supervisor. He'd stamped non-compliant in 3 places and attached photos. The pictures were close-ups. A corner of the coop where a cracked beam showed with dust, which I'd planned to replace the next week. A feed sack with a damp patch from the rain. A hand-washing station with a shadow that looked like dirt in a macro shot. Technical language wrapped his claims like barbed wire. He cited insufficient rodent control, possible cross-contamination in feed storage, and deficiencies in personal hygiene stations. He recommended temporary suspension of organic sales pending remediation. Reading that formal language, that cold, professional condemnation, felt like someone removing the foundation from under me while smiling politely. My neighbors started acting as if I'd committed a crime. Kids stopped bringing their families to my pumpkin patch. The bank manager asked to review my accounts during a routine meeting. I could see the ledger of my life being tallied in their heads. Mortgage, loan, equipment payments, hungry mouths. Through it all, Karen sent me perfectly cheerful messages. "So glad the USDA is looking out for the neighborhood," she typed once. 3 exclamation marks like a garrote. I deleted them and later watched her stand on her porch while neighbors patted her back. She'd won at least for now. But there were a few people who didn't turn away. Old Tom from down the lane came by with a thermos of coffee and a photo album. "You remember when the county tried to take your pasture from you?" he asked, sliding a faded photo across the table. "They couldn't prove a thing. Folks like you stick in my mind." His faith was a small ember. It wasn't enough to relight the whole barn, but it reminded me that I had allies. I started digging, not by email or calls that would go in some USDA file, but by old-fashioned asking. I drove to neighboring towns, knocked on doors, and asked about Riley. The pattern wasn't a rumor. It was a map. Several farms, small operations like mine, had complaints filed against them after disputes with neighbors. In at least 2 cases, the inspector's findings later seemed convenient. One farmer told me he'd lost certification for 6 months over an alleged contamination that vanished after an appeal and retesting. This was beginning to look like more than incompetence. It smelled like a pattern. A man who could pick one farm out of 100 and make paperwork do his bidding. I filed a formal complaint with the USDA's Inspector Oversight Unit. The woman I spoke with was polite, but there was a lot of "we'll look into it" in her voice. Paperwork breeds more paperwork. Comforts you with the illusion of action. That night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and thinking about what I could really use to flip the script. Reports and oversight reviews might take months. I needed something immediate, undeniable, and clean. That's when I went back to the folder I'd pulled the first night, the old inspection file from 2 years ago. I compared Riley's notes from back then to his notes now. There were similarities in tone, phrasing, even the angle of photos. He used the same sentences. He framed things the same way. It was like reading a script with the same villain. And there it was, in the margins of the old file, a notation about off-site meetings with local officials. A scribble that looked like someone had jotted down a coffee shop and a time. I hadn't noticed it before, but it alone was enough to spark the idea crawling at the back of my brain. If Riley was cozying up to locals to Karen, perhaps then his impartiality was compromised. If he was meeting off-site with people who had something to gain from shutting farms down, that was a conflict of interest. That was a line I could follow. I thought about the one thing he hadn't inspected the first time or the second. Not my coop. Not my feed. Not my records. He hadn't inspected himself. He hadn't accounted for his own movements or contacts. He hadn't explained why his complaints followed certain neighbors. My plan, then, would be to make him account for them. I started small. I posted a handwritten flyer at the feed store, at the coop, at the post office. "Have you been contacted by Inspector D. Riley? Call me. Confidential." The calls came slow at first, then more frequent. People were wary. They didn't like trouble. But a few farmers, the ones who owed me favors, and the ones tired of being bullied, agreed to meet. We formed a loose circle in the back of the diner one evening, coffee cooling in front of us, maps spread across the table. We compared dates, complaints, names. The pattern became a bulldozer. Riley visited after certain neighbors complained. In one case, a neighbor had business in sealing off a small plot of land for a development. Suddenly, a farm nearby got hit with a contamination claim. It wasn't proof. Not yet, but it was enough to act on. When I left the diner that night, my hands were warm from the coffee and my jaw was set. I wasn't just going to wait for paperwork to grind through. I needed to force the issue into the light where truth lives. I decided to gather everything I could. Receipts, timestamps, neighbor testimonies, and most important, real-time documentation. Cameras, lab tests, signed affidavits. In short, I would build a case that could stand up to Riley's neat little stamps. And I would bait him not with lies, but with the one thing his reports couldn't ignore, incontrovertible evidence that tied his complaints to his own pattern of behavior. I slept a few hours that night, then woke before dawn. The plan had weight now. It pressed at my chest like a promise. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about survival, mine, my family's, and the small trust the community had placed in honest food. I gathered tools, contacts, and a stubbornness older than the fence posts. By noon the next day, I had a portable camera hidden above the hand-washing station, lab sample kits on order, and 2 farmers ready to sign sworn statements. Riley thought he could file a report and walk away with a farmer's life in his briefcase. He didn't know we were already lining up the mirrors to reflect his image back at him. I was going to make him regret what he'd done, not with shouting or threats, but with paperwork so tight it cut clean. The quietest kind of justice. The air was cold the morning Riley came back. I heard his truck before I saw it, the low diesel growl that made my stomach knot. It was one of those mornings where fog hugged the ground, making the barn and coop look ghostly. My goats stirred uneasily, like they could feel the tension too. He stepped out, crisp uniform, sunglasses even though the sun wasn't up yet, clipboard in hand, same as before, same smug little smirk. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "we're here for a follow-up inspection." That's when I noticed he wasn't alone. A woman got out of the passenger side, another inspector, younger, holding a tablet. She didn't make eye contact. Probably an observer or trainee. Riley handed her the file like a man about to perform for an audience. I forced a polite nod. "You're back sooner than I expected." "Expediency," he said almost proudly. "We take community complaints seriously." Community complaints. Translation: Karen's been busy. He walked toward the coop, already noting things under his breath. I trailed behind him, camera in my cap, recording every step. The little lens hidden in the stitching wasn't fancy, but it was clear enough. The battery would last the day. "Looks like you repaired the beam," Riley said, pointing at the chicken coop's reinforced frame. "Yes, sir," I replied. "It's sealed, weatherproofed, and certified safe by the county carpenter." He hummed, unimpressed. Then he gestured toward the feed shed. "You still storing organic and non-organic feed in the same building?" "I only use certified organic feed. Always have," I said, my voice sharper than intended. He scribbled something. The woman beside him typed silently, fingers fluttering across the tablet. Then came the moment that would tip everything. Riley stopped near the hand-washing station, the same one he'd called unsanitary before, and crouched. "Still some dust here," he said, swiping his gloved finger across the rim. He held it up theatrically. "You see that dust?" I said flatly. "Outside. On a farm." He smirked. "The code doesn't make exceptions for outdoor dust." I almost laughed, but I knew better. He wasn't here for dust. He was here for control. He motioned toward the barn. "Let's check your water source." Now, this was where things got interesting, because this time, I'd set up the field test, a USDA-approved water testing kit from the same lab they used. I'd taken a sample the night before and kept it sealed. I wanted him to test the same water to see how his report would compare. He filled his vial. I filled mine. We sealed them both. I labeled mine farm sample A1. He labeled his USDA case 347B. When he wasn't looking, I took a time-stamped photo of both labels. I wanted an exact record. Every minute, every mark. As we wrapped up, Karen wandered over from her yard dressed in her usual pastel sweater set, phone in hand like she was filming a documentary. "Oh, Inspector," she chirped. "I just wanted to thank you again for keeping the neighborhood safe. You wouldn't believe how much noise those roosters make at dawn." Riley didn't stop her, didn't tell her to stay back. He just smiled politely, which was all I needed to see. I spoke up. "Karen, this is a USDA inspection. You're not authorized to interfere." "Oh, relax," she said, grinning. "I'm just an interested citizen." But the smirk she shared with Riley wasn't innocent. It was a silent exchange between co-conspirators, 2 people who thought they were untouchable. I let her talk. Let Riley ignore protocol. Because my cameras, the ones by the fence and coop, were catching everything. When he finally wrapped up, Riley turned to me with that same official tone he'd practiced for years. "We'll be finalizing the report within the week. If the issues persist, your certification will be revoked." "Understood," I said, but my voice was steady now, calm, because I had him. As his truck pulled away, I went straight to my shed and opened my laptop. I pulled up the footage, crisp, clear, time-stamped. There it was, Riley allowing a civilian to interfere during an inspection. Riley collecting water samples improperly. Riley using the same pre-written violation phrases as before. And best of all, the audio where he whispered to the trainee, thinking the mic on his shirt was muted. Same guy as last time. Let's keep the notes consistent. Headquarters likes uniform reports. My jaw tightened. Consistent. He wasn't inspecting. He was copying. 2 days later, I received his new report via email. Severe noncompliance, it said this time. He claimed my water tested positive for coliform bacteria, meaning potential contamination. He cited health hazards, urged immediate suspension of sales, and even included a recommendation for full farm closure pending remediation. But the kicker? His report said the test was done on April 12, 9:47 a.m. My timestamped video showed him collecting the sample at April 13, 10:06 a.m. The full day off, which meant he'd reused an old report again. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a bad inspection. It was fraud. I took my sealed sample to the same USDA-certified lab myself, paid out of pocket for rush results. 3 days later, the report came back. No coliform detected. Water source clean and safe. The difference between our reports wasn't small, it was criminal. So I went to the one person I knew would care, not because she liked me, but because she hated being embarrassed. Regional Director Marjorie Clancy. I called her office, asked for a 10-minute slot, and emailed her the subject line: evidence of falsified USDA inspection urgent. She called back within an hour. When I sat across from her the next morning, her office smelled like old paper and disinfectant. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful. She didn't waste time. "You're alleging misconduct by Inspector Riley?" she asked, eyes narrowing. "I'm not alleging," I said, sliding over the folder. "I'm proving." Inside were the photos. "She's your neighbor?" "Yes." "And she had contact with him prior to inspection?" "Multiple times. Calls, visits, you name it." Her pen paused midair. "That violates federal inspection neutrality policy." I leaned forward. "I know." For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the ceiling fan. Then she closed the folder. "We'll handle this internally," she said carefully. "But I'll need to request that you don't share this publicly until we complete our inquiry." I met her eyes. "I'll stay quiet as long as justice isn't." She didn't smile, but her eyes flickered with something like respect. I left her office with a strange calm. I didn't know how far the investigation would go or how long it would take. But for the first time in weeks, I felt the wind shift. Then, 3 days later, everything exploded. I was in the barn fixing a latch when 2 USDA vehicles rolled up, not one. Riley wasn't in the first car this time. He was in the second, sitting stiffly, his expression pale. The woman from before the trainee stepped out first, this time wearing an official badge with the word auditor underneath. She walked up to me and extended a hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said firmly, "we're here to conduct an internal investigation regarding Inspector Riley." My heart thudded. "So it's happening." She nodded. "We'd like your cooperation." Behind her, I caught sight of Riley being led toward the coupe, not as an inspector this time, but as the inspected. The irony was almost too perfect to put into words. If you've ever watched justice unfold in real time, you know it doesn't come with fireworks. It comes in quiet moments, the shift in someone's eyes when they realize the power isn't theirs anymore. That morning, it was Riley's turn to look small. The air had that brittle chill of early spring, sunlight sharp as glass through the bare trees. The 2 USDA auditors, the woman who'd once shadowed Riley, and her supervisor, began their inspection not of my farm, but of his work. Every motion was methodical, measured, and tense. I leaned against the fence, arms crossed, while Riley hovered near his truck like a dog that knew the leash had shortened. "Mr. Hayes," said the lead auditor, "we're here to verify procedural accuracy in Inspector Riley's recent reports. You've provided documentation, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, handing over my neatly labeled binder, every timestamp, Every screenshot, every discrepancy, each cross-reference to his official report. She flipped through it, expression unreadable. This is thorough. Years of practice following their rules, I said, nodding toward Riley. I figured I'd play by the same playbook. Her lips curved slightly, not a smile, more like acknowledgement. She and her assistant began their walkthrough. I followed at a distance, careful not to interfere. They rechecked the hand-washing station, the feed storage, the coop ventilation, even the water source. Everything, every single thing, passed inspection. The young auditor turned to her boss. All readings normal. No contaminants detected. Structural integrity within compliance. Her boss wrote a note. Thank you. Please photograph each sample. Riley watched in silence, arms stiff, face drained of its usual smug color. He tried to interject once. With respect, I'd like to clarify that the previous test, the supervisor cut him off. You'll have your opportunity, Inspector. Right now, we're observing procedure which you'll recall requires impartiality. He swallowed his words. It was hard not to savor the moment, the irony of it all. He had strutted around my property like a man with divine authority, quoting codes and regulations like scripture. Now those same rules had turned on him, sharper than any blade. When they were done, the lead auditor gathered her notes and faced me. Mr. Hayes, preliminary findings show no issues with your operation. Your certification remains valid. I exhaled slowly. Thank you. Then she added, lowering her voice just slightly, and thank you for documenting everything. Most folks don't. It made this process much easier. I nodded. I learned that the hard way. Riley's jaw flexed. He tried one last stand. This farm has had multiple complaints, ma'am. The local community, she interrupted, does not dictate federal compliance. That silenced him. As the auditors returned to their vehicles, Riley stood alone, pretending to check his clipboard. His hands shook. When he finally met my eyes, his expression was pure venom, the kind of hate that comes from being caught. I walked toward him slowly, boots crunching on the gravel. Looks like you missed something again, I said quietly. He frowned. Excuse me? I pointed to the sign by the barn, a laminated USDA compliance certificate, stamped and dated that very morning. You missed the truth. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left for him to say. The auditors drove off first. Riley followed, slower, his truck's tailgate rattling as he turned onto the dirt road. For a long moment, I just stood there, listening to the sound fade away, that low diesel growl disappearing into the hills. The farm was silent again. The chickens clucked softly, goats bleated, and the breeze carried the faint scent of hay and dust. I should have felt relief, but what I felt was something heavier, vindication. Still, I knew better than to think it was over. The USDA doesn't move fast, but it moves deep. And when it finds rot in its ranks, it cuts hard. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I got a call. Mr. Hayes? This is Director Clancy. Her voice was clipped, professional. Yes, ma'am. I wanted to inform you that Inspector Riley has been suspended pending a full internal investigation. There's credible evidence of falsified reports and conflict of interest. He'll be facing review by the Office of Inspector General. I didn't say anything for a second, just stared out at my field sun stretching gold over the grass, animals grazing in quiet peace. That's good to hear, I finally said. Thank you for letting me know. She hesitated before adding, for what it's worth, not many farmers would have gone through the proper channels. You did, and it mattered. After the call, I went outside and sat on the porch. Across the property line, Karen was pruning her hydrangeas like nothing had happened. I half expected her to look up, to say something smug, to toss one last jab. But she didn't. She wouldn't even make eye contact. Word must have reached her. A week later, she sold her house. According to Tom, she told the realtor the neighborhood wasn't what she expected. Poetic justice has a way of moving quietly, too. Before she left, I found a letter in my mailbox. No name, no signature, just a single line written in shaky handwriting. Didn't think he'd take it this far. I'm sorry. I burned it in the wood stove without a word. That evening, as the sun sank low, I walked to the barn and looked around, the beams solid, the air clean, the animals calm. The same farm Riley had tried to destroy now stood as proof of his failure. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. And the next morning, when I drove to the farmer's market, people smiled again. Marla waved from her booth. The co-op rep shook my hand. Even the blogger who'd written that smear piece came up, sheepish. "Guess I was wrong about you," she said. I just smiled. Guess we all learned something about truth. My stall sold out before noon. But the best part came later, when a white envelope arrived from the USDA. Inside was a formal letter stamped with the agency seal. Following a completed investigation, Inspector Daniel Riley has been terminated for falsification of federal records and violation of inspection ethics. Your farm remains in full compliance and will be used as an example in upcoming training programs. I read it twice, then pinned it to the wall of my barn right beside the photo of my grandfather standing with his first herd. It wasn't about pride. It was about peace. The system that nearly crushed me had, in the end, corrected itself. Not because I shouted the loudest, but because I learned the rules and turned them back where they belonged. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the cracks until the walls give way. Months passed. The frost lifted. The fields greened. And life on the farm slipped back into rhythm. The hens laid more than ever. The goats fattened for market. And I could finally walk through my land without that knot in my chest, that feeling that someone, somewhere, was waiting to take it all away. But the truth is, after a storm like that, peace feels strange. It's too quiet, too clean. You start to wonder when the next hit will come. Only, it didn't. The USDA didn't send another inspector for a long while. When they finally did, it was a new guy, young, polite, methodical. He shook my hand, introduced himself, and said, "We're just here to make sure everything's running smooth, Mr. Hayes. No arrogance, no suspicion, just professionalism." And that alone felt like a miracle. He walked the property, took a few notes, complimented my record-keeping, then turned to leave. Before he did, he said something I didn't expect. "You're the Hayes that turned in Riley, right?" I froze. "I didn't turn anyone in. I just told the truth." He smiled. "Well, sir, in this job, that's the same thing." And just like that, he left. That night, I sat out on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the lights fade over the hills. The barn glowed warm in the dusk, the animals settling down. Crickets hummed. The smell of hay and cedar filled the air. My grandfather used to say, "The land always knows who respects it." I used to think that was just an old man's poetry. But after what happened, I realized he was right. When Riley tried to bury me under paperwork and lies, it wasn't just me he disrespected. It was the land itself. This soil fed my family for generations. It gave us everything, and in return, all it ever asked was honesty. Riley came here with greed and ego, trying to twist that truth into something dirty. But the earth doesn't forget, and neither do the people who live by it. I found out later that Riley's case made waves. Turns out he'd pulled similar stunts on other small farms, mostly older farmers, folks who didn't have the energy to fight back. Some had lost their certifications entirely. One even sold his land. But after my case hit the Internal Review Board, those farmers were contacted again. A few even had their licenses reinstated. Riley's name became a warning in the training manuals, how not to conduct an inspection. I'd be lying if I said that didn't make me smile. A few months later, I got invited to speak at a local agricultural meeting. They wanted me to talk about compliance preparedness, which, honestly, was just a fancy way of saying how to survive the next surprise inspection. I stood in front of a room full of tired faces, calloused hands, people who looked like they'd seen enough red tape to wrap the moon. I didn't talk about revenge or about winning. I talked about truth. Every paper they make you fill out, I told them, isn't just bureaucracy. It's a weapon, and you get to choose how to use it. Keep records. Take photos. Know your rights. Because when the system comes for you, you don't fight it by yelling. You fight it by knowing it better than the ones who abuse it. After the talk, a few folks shook my hand. One older man said quietly, "Wish I'd known this before they shut my dairy down." I didn't have an answer for him, just a nod. Life has a funny way of circling back. Last week, I got a letter, this one from the USDA regional office. Inside was a small certificate, nothing fancy. It read, "In recognition of exemplary compliance and cooperation in advancing agricultural integrity." They called it a model farm designation. I called it irony with a seal on it. I pinned it next to Riley's termination letter. Two pieces of paper, one born of lies, the other of truth, hanging side by side like balance restored. That evening, the sun sank behind the ridge, painting the sky the color of copper and fire. I walked the fence line, ran my hand over the smooth wood, felt the pulse of life humming beneath the soil. The land felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I used to think justice was something you chased. Now I know sometimes it finds you, after you've done everything right and still lost. Sometimes it waits until the noise dies down, then slips in quietly, like rain after drought. That's what this was. Quiet rain. So when people ask what happened, how I beat the inspector, how I kept my farm, I tell them the truth. I didn't beat anyone. I just waited long enough for the truth to speak louder than the lies. And out here, surrounded by fields that breathe and soil that remembers, that's the kind of justice that lasts.